Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining our Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition National Call. I'm going to give folks a minute or so to join on the line, and then we can get started. Okay, let's go right ahead. Thank you guys for joining today's Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition National Call. As many of you know, the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition includes 850 national, state, and local organizations. Many of them have worked directly on disaster recovery efforts and in communities that have been impacted. We all work together to ensure that federal efforts reach all impacted households, including those with the lowest incomes and those who are most marginalized, because we know that these are the households often hardest hit by disasters, but who face the longest, steepest road to recovery afterwards. On today's call, we're going to hear about federal, state, and local governments and how they're responding to the housing needs following Hurricanes Fiona and Ian. We'll learn from leaders in impacted communities about what they're seeing on the ground. And we'll also learn about needed legislation that's been endorsed by the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition to help move us in a direction towards a more complete and equitable recovery. Just as a reminder, we're holding these national calls every Tuesday at 2 o'clock. We also have working group calls that you can join to dig into issues more. Our disaster working group meets on Wednesdays, where we have deeper, more in-depth conversations about recovery framework and reforms that are needed. And we have also a Puerto Rico working group that meets on Thursdays that you can join as well. I'm going to share in the chat box a link to find out more information about our weekly calls and ways for you to participate. I also wanted to share with you a link to where you can find information about updates on the responses to Hurricanes Fiona and Ian. Especially if you're in a disaster impacted community, you might want to check that out to see what new federal resources are coming online. And with that, we're going to go ahead and get started with our agenda. I'm going to pause first, though, just to check in with our team to make sure we're able to go forward. Great. John, if you can come on board. Our first speaker is John Laycock. He's a research analyst with Texas Appleseed, who's going to share with us some of the great research that he's been doing and looking into individual assistance from FEMA.
Hi. Yes, so thank you, Sarah, for that introduction. My name is John Laycock, and I'm sorry that I'm wearing my D&D shirt. I work at Texas Appleseed. I'm on a grant from the Ford Foundation to do data analysis related to disaster recovery. So I've been working on that for a little more than a year. And so the data set I principally work with is Open FEMA's Individuals and Household Program Valid Registrations data set, which is a Noah, can you start the slides? Next slide. Next one. Noah, the next slide. There we go. Sorry about that. It's the individual assistance data that records creates a record for every single application for disaster assistance received by FEMA for every storm going back to 2002. So this is a very big data set. It's now 18.8 million rows. And it's got a wealth of information if you can dig into it. Principally what it records is what storm or fire or whatever disaster, the location down to county and zip code, and actually for some storms down to census tract, whether funding was granted and how much funding was granted. And that's broken down by housing assistance and other needs assistance. So housing assistance is principally to repair your home or to find alternate housing while your home is being repaired. And other needs assistance is for other needs like groceries or replacing clothing or getting diapers or that kind of thing. And I think some people know there's critical needs assistance available in both Puerto Rico and Florida right now. That's it. Without going through a full vetted application process, FEMA will give you $700 as long as you assert that you have critical needs. And they'll do it immediately and then go back and calculate other needs assistance. But the $700 is considered part of other needs assistance. So if ultimately you're approved for $1,300, they would give you $600 more and not a new $1,300. And then it also, for housing assistance, it records whether an applicant was approved or denied and why. So this is very important to understand how FEMA is treating the recovery process. If they're denying like 80% of applicants and they say storms that were on the beach in Fort Myers don't have any flood damage, you can kind of just build a picture of that they're not doing their job or whether they are doing their job. And there's some demographic data in this data set. It records whether an applicant owns or rents, what their income level is, from no income, less than $15,000, $15,000 to $30,000, all the way up to more than $175,000 in household income. It records the age of the householder, what type of housing they have. So that's important in Florida because so many mobile homes were damaged by Hurricane Ian. It does not include race and ethnicity data. FEMA just started collecting that, or is not going to collect that until next year, and then might not make it available. But for these other kind of demographics, you can put together a picture of vulnerable users and see if they are being treated the same as, if low-income renters are being treated the same as wealthy homeowners. Noah, next slide. How I'm using this data, or how this data can be used, you can map damage because it has location data associated it, so you can show raw applications, just how many people are asking for assistance, and that can be a better metric than FEMA's inspected damage. FEMA's inspectors are often inaccurate, and I think a lot of them are trained to find the least amount of damage possible. And so just mapping raw applications is helpful to visualize where damage is occurring. And then often it's good to normalize that data by the number of households. You can get household data by county or census tract or zip code from the census. So for instance, Tampa has more applications than Fort Myers, but Tampa also has 3 times as many people, so that's expected. And then again, you can do demographics and eligibility and ask if low-income applicants are getting the same amount of money or more. And then the last thing we'll talk about is housing denials and ownership verification. So now if you can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is housing status. FEMA records for every application whether the applicant, the outcome of their housing status application by codes You can see here there are a lot of codes. For instance, EHR means they're eligible for home repairs, but IID, IIDV is ineligible for insufficient damage and failed identity verification. One very important code that I'm tracking is IOWNV. That means ineligible due to ownership verification. This is important in Puerto Rico because Puerto Rico has a different system of ownership than the mainland. It's harder to prove that you own your home in Puerto Rico just because of how the legal system is set up. And there's more informal ownership. In Hurricane Maria, this was a huge problem. 77,000 applications, about 10% of all applications were improperly rejected because the applicant could not prove ownership. In 2021, FEMA was supposed to start accepting accepting additional proofs of applications, so they would not end up rejecting as much. And right now, it looks like if you look over at rejections, because of ownership not verified, adding up every single yellow line there, you get that there's about 3,700, 3,800 rejections for ownership out of not quite a little more than 40,000 total determinations. So that means FEMA is rejecting about 1 in 10 applications for ownership reasons again. So we're having the same problem we had in Hurricane Maria showing up all again. And then just real quickly, because I know I'm running on time, a couple examples of maps. Noah, next slide. So here is a map of Puerto Rico that maps, this is from last week, I haven't updated it, maps total damage and also damage normalized by the number of households. So the color of each municipio is how much damage per household, with green being less damage per, or fewer applications per household, orange and red more applications per household. And you can see, if you look at the bottom, the 2 red counties next to Ponce are coastal counties nearest to the storm that were heavily flooded. And then the mountainous areas in the interior are also red and were heavily flooded. And then the size of the dot on each municipio is proportionate to the total applications. And you can see that San Juan and Ponce have more applications than other places, but they also have more people. So that's to be expected. And then last slide. This is a similar map for Florida. The darker red colors had more applications per capita or per household. And you can just see the black line is the storm track. So it makes sense. The storm went right through Fort Myers and Cape Coral, the red counties on the coast, and then weakened and hit the pink counties, and then strengthened again as it got to coastal counties one more time. So this is useful, I think, for just visualizing the storm and the storm damage. And then as more applications are approved or not approved for eligibility, we can look and start digging into that data in weeks to come.
Thank you so much, John. I do have a couple of questions here.
Okay.
I'm wondering, are you, because you said you had historical data from past disasters as well, are you seeing any trends with denial rates? Are denials going up over time, or are you seeing differences in denial rates between different disaster impacted areas?
This is a great question. I think, as I mentioned, the Biden administration made some reforms in 2021, and they kind of said we're going to accept, we're going to try to accept more people and say yes rather than trying to say no. And so if you look at results after Hurricane Ida, a huge, I think, almost everyone was accepted for individual assistance. Whereas if you compare to Hurricane Harvey, it was about 50%, half of all people were rejected, even from the hardest hit areas. And if you look at Hurricane Sandy, I think it was an even lower rejection rate. So I think the trend is up, and I think the trend was increased a whole lot in 2021. I think NLIHC said there were 100,000 households that received assistance who would not have received assistance under the 2020 rules. And so right now in Florida and Puerto Rico, we're just trying to make sure FEMA keeps up that work and its promise to help as many people as possible.
Thank you so much for that. It's really helpful to see this information. I'm hoping that other advocates can also plug into this open FEMA data to find out more about what's happening in their community. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about where can advocates find this data? Is it through open FEMA, or are there other sources? Do you have to go through a FOIA request? What's the process for that?
So it is available in open FEMA. Unfortunately, it's available only as this big 18.8 million row data set that's 6.5 gigs in size. So you need a stable internet connection and you need advanced software. Excel can only open up to 1 million rows. I think so. NLIHC, I know, is preparing a letter asking Open FEMA to make this more accessible. In the meantime, I think because it's really important for advocates to have this information, it would be, you could reach out to me or someone else at Texas Appleseed and we can kind of crack it open and just give you data for one storm. I think we'd be happy to do that for anyone on this call.
That's so wonderful. We will definitely share your contact information in the follow-up email that will go out on Friday in our newsletter, but I hope folks take you up on that because this information can be incredibly important as recovery efforts are ongoing. Yeah. So thank you so much, John, for joining with us. If you're able to stay on and answer some questions in the Q&A box, I invite you to do that and appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the opportunity. And should I just type responses to the Q&A box?
Yes, welcome to do that.
All right, great. Thank you.
Great. Now we're going to shift gears. We're going to hear from our partners in disaster impacted areas. We're going to start with Mary Williams, who's the State Disaster Housing Coordinator of the Bureau of Recovery at the Florida Division of Emergency Management. Mary, are you able to join with us?
I am.
Great. Thank you so much for being here. I'll turn it over to you.
Good afternoon. I want to first start by saying the state of Florida is so appreciative of all of the thoughts and prayers and well wishes that we've gotten from around the country. It is what is helping us to stay hopeful and keeping us moving ahead. So we really appreciate everything. We still know we have a long road ahead of us, but we are actively in the theater doing what we need to do to bring people back to their normal. We've currently have 24 counties that have been designated for FEMA IA, and those counties are Charlotte, Collier, DeSoto, Flagler, Hardy, Hillsborough, Lee County, Manatee, Orange, Osceola, Pinellas, Palm Beach, Polk, Putnam, Sarasota, Seminole, St. John's, Volusia County, Highlands, Lake, Brevard, Henry, Monroe, and Okeechobee counties. Now, the total number of applications as of 6 o'clock this morning was 4,195. We've actually opened up our DRCs and we are adding more locations as we speak. We are getting them vetted and added on. In Lee County, we have 2 DRCs open. Those are disaster recovery centers. In Charlotte, we have 1. Sarasota, there's 1. Collier has 1. Osceola has 1. Orange has 1. Hardy has 1. Seminole and Polk each have 1. Now, FEMA has authorized transitional shelter assistance, and this will help survivors moving into non-congregate hotels rather than the shelters where they currently are. Now, the state and FEMA are working together to scope the disaster housing mission. And the state has submitted a formal request for disaster housing, for direct housing to FEMA. Working with the Florida Housing Coalition, we will be hosting a statewide stakeholders call tomorrow. With FEMA's Marcus Coleman on 10/13, not tomorrow, 10/13, to discuss the current phase of recovery and how best to support the survivors as they navigate applying for assistance. Now, it's critical for us to engage community-based organizations, VOADs, and any faith-based communities across the hurricane impacted areas, because they can get to the people who are normally least served, and those are our target audience right now. Even our emergency manager director is in the field right now to make sure that we are going to those with access and functional needs, and any BIPOC populations and any underserved community, that we're doing everything we can to reach out and let them know that we are here, and let them know that even if they don't know how to use the internet to do what they need to do, that our disaster recovery center personnel will be available to them to help them make that happen. And one of the things that they are definitely going to work on is those people who may not feel they qualify because previous visits to FEMA, but now that the guidelines have been broadened, we need them to know that this service is available to them, and please come in and apply. Now, are there any questions for me?
Yes, thank you so much, Mary, for joining with us. I am wondering what, it's a big task ahead to recover from the hurricane. I'm wondering if you're thinking about what are your very top priorities right now in this moment. I know that can change over time, but if you're looking at the work ahead, what are you most focused on?
My top priority is getting people to apply to apply to FEMA for eligibility, because nothing happens until that application is in and approved. And so we're trying to muster all of our talent, marshal everything we're doing toward getting the information out through any avenue possible. And then our job is to get people out of temporary shelters back to permanency.
Absolutely. And we share that concern with you as well. We know that one of the most challenging things after disaster is getting people into stable, affordable housing for the long term. I'm wondering, what can we as advocates do to support you in this work and to be helpful for you?
What I understand that you all are currently doing is exactly what we need to have done. We need to have people being able to sit down with lawmakers, policymakers, who can change and improve the way we've been handling disasters. We want to concentrate on building toward resiliency, so there's not redundancy in helping people. If they can survive the storm, then they won't need as much help.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I noticed in our initial analysis of the areas that were impacted by disasters or impacted by this hurricane is that there was a really large number of mobile homeowners who've been impacted. And we know from past experience, because of the many issues that John went over with title issues, that mobile homeowners are very, very frequently denied FEMA assistance. I'm wondering, is this on your radar? And if so, what sort of steps are you taking to address the needs of mobile homeowners who are applying for assistance?
More of those mobile homeowners will be under the new guidelines able to get help, get assistance. Luckily, well, I won't say luckily, but blessedly, the new administration saw that that was a problem, and these new guidelines allow them to be eligible for those benefits. And we are directing them to please come and apply. And if you know any community-based organizations, whether they're VOAD partners or not, any church groups who live in that area, please have them send everybody to one of our disaster recovery centers or to disasterassistance.gov and make the application. We are begging people to please apply and let us help you through the process. And one of the things that people often do is they get a denial letter and they just stop. Quite often it's only a missing piece of information, and we just need people to, if they don't understand it, go to the Disaster Recovery Center and they will walk you through getting that.
I'm not sure if that's just on my end, but I think Mary might have cut out.
I'm here.
Oh, well, perfect.
I said, I don't know if I'm frozen or you are, but I'm here.
Okay, great. I love that point that you raised. A lot of the times we see people get those denial letters and they don't realize that it's often just a matter of turning in some additional paperwork in order for their application to move forward. I encourage folks to check out their legal aid attorneys, that they can also help them. And do you happen to know, I see here a question from the audience that maybe the deadline to apply is Thursday, September, hold on. Is this Thursday, October 13th? Is that correct? Is that the final deadline?
No, the deadline was extended to 60 days from declaration, from the date of declaration.
Okay, great. So if people have more time to be submitting their applications and reaching out to you in your office for help. So that's
absolutely. And that's why we have so many troops on the ground to make sure they know that, there is a deadline, but we're trying to get them all herded in and serviced before that deadline.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mary, for joining with us. I appreciate it. If you're able to stay on and answer a few questions in the Q&A box, you can do that. But we really appreciate you joining with us and look forward to you in this new role, and happy to work with you and continue to support you.
I thank you all for inviting us here. Just spread the word, everybody.
Absolutely. So our next speaker is Dr. Evis Garcia, Associate Professor, Landscape Architecture and Urban Planning at Texas A&M. I know that we've worked very closely with her through our Puerto Rico working group, and she's done some incredible work. So I'm so glad that she's able to join with us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Sarah. And I have some slides, perhaps too many slides, but I was hoping to go quickly over them. So I don't know if you have them.
I think we might be having some delays with the slides, but we'll try to move forward as much as possible. And now my colleague reminded me that you were an intern with NLHC back in the day. So I'm so glad that there's this long-standing connection between our work.
Yes, that is correct. That was back in 2010. So it has been a while. I'm just very happy to still be connected to the National Low Income Housing Coalition. So I think that I could just share my own slides. So maybe that will make things a little bit easier. Again, I'm Evis Garcia. I'm an associate professor at Texas A&M. And today I will talk about a paper that I wrote, which is titled Deemed Ineligible. So this outlines what are the reasons that homeowners in Puerto Rico were denied of aid after Hurricane Maria. And part of it is can we look back to what happened during Hurricane Maria, so we can look forward into Fiona and see what has been some of the advances and what we might expect. As mentioned, I am part of the Disaster Recovery Coalition and the weekly calls. So this paper, which actually you can find if you go to the National Low Income Housing Coalition website, it was born from these discussions that we were having weekly. I also looked at other documentation. I did a lot of work in Puerto Rico, including interviews. And this is just like to give you some numbers of like the disaster response and assistance after Hurricane Maria for the individual household program. So in Puerto Rico, there are like 1.2 million units, and the vast majority of people. So were actually the 92% of the units had some damage. So that's like 1.1. And of those, 98% apply for the IHP program, which is like pretty remarkable. However, like when we look at the decisions that were made by FEMA, as you can see, 40% were approved, while 60% were not. Of those, like about 30% were because of their ineligibility, and the other 30% because they were like formally denied. But the result is the end, that 60% of people did not receive assistance. And even if they approve of that, like this 30%, they appeal, but the vast majority, 75%, were not just approved after their appeals. And one of the big reasons, as like it has been mentioned here, and probably many of you know, is that in Puerto Rico, there's a lot of informality, and informality comes in different ways. So of course, like people build informally without having permits, or without an architect, engineer, land use codes. So we're talking about like about 50%. It is on that category. But the main issue for FEMA is that people have no deeds, and this is about 20% of all homes in Puerto Rico. And John showed that big list of where, like, the many reasons that someone can be denied, and there's like 41 codes for denial, that people were not contacted, they had like duplicate addresses, and so on. But in Puerto Rico, it was the no proof of ownership. This is like 15% of all the denials. And looking at the data that John was just showing us, like in Fiona, this has been 10% until now. So we will have to keep track of that. And maybe there has been, again, some advances in advocacy that hopefully results in that number being lower, although obviously like 10% still pretty high. Lower than with Maria. But here, like, we just show you like some of the more specifics of like what does it mean in Puerto Rico people not having title. So there's a lot of like gentlemen's agreements in where like people will sell a property just like verbally, and they don't have to have a title. And this is an example of like someone who bought the land like about 20 years ago from someone for $1,500. But of course, this person could not prove that they were the legitimate homeowner. And we have this like a case study of like people that are living in the home of a deceased parent, but they haven't resolved the inheritance issues. And we see this issue a lot in the United States as well, right? One of the things that make it a little bit harder as well is that many times people do not change their water or electricity bills. So even getting documentation, alternative ways of documentation is still pretty hard. And there's issues of like subdivision, in where you might have like a family land and your family start to like just subdivide the land, but they obviously didn't have the formal process of doing that. And the other issues are, for example, that there has been a lot of people that have worked in the land of employers. This is particularly like in places that are very much agricultural. in where you have the persons who were the employer giving someone a piece of land in exchange for part of their labor, but that was like never actually like formalized. Perhaps the vast majority of the cases are going to be that people rescue lands, meaning that they went to own that. People knew that it was owned by the government, and because of the inability of the government to provide a lot of like public housing or housing for low-income families, people organize and might together take land that belongs to the government. And over time, the government has led people to being there in many of these spaces. Actually, people organize their own nonprofits, and there's like nonprofits that might manage these kind of like is a land trust, but without the legality of being a land trust either. So when we like, I think that Jonas also like mentioned this in terms of like the different perhaps differences in property law. So I guess that I would say it's less about the law and it's more about the practices, again, that people are not required to get like a piece of paper, and people don't have to register their property if they sell it. However, in terms of like the definitions of what it means to be owner, I would say that the property law in Puerto Rico is very much about like defined here. So the person doesn't have to have a title to be owner. And if you look at the Robert Stafford Act and more at the federal government, we can say that it's like very similar in that way, that a person is responsible for paying taxes and maintenance of residence. And that makes them an owner. However, documentation in the United States is more culturally what people do. So again, that's kind of like the major differences. But because ownership, again, even at the federal government's, the way that might be defined, it's you can prove that in alternative ways, perhaps if you're an owner, then that's kind of like a main point in order to be able to convince FEMA, right, that people can use these other ways of proving ownership outside of a title. And so the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition, we're like working with FEMA to create this like sworn statement for homeownership verification, and this actually was like approved on August 6th of 2018. So basically, what that did, it was that people could show invoices of repairs that they have that they were planning to make, or repair, or just receipts of repairs that already had made, and they can also, like, for example, show from a government entity that they were the owners, and just like, again, different ways of doing that have to do with maintenance, inheritance, or possession. And kind of like the problem that persisted in Puerto Rico is that this like sworn statement still wasn't like a FEMA document. So a lot of the FEMA staff wasn't aware that it existed, or if they knew, they were not like trained, they didn't know how it worked. And a lot of the work was actually done by nonprofit organizations. As you might know, right, that we're not being paid for do this, but they're doing their advocacy. And this is like more recent news or press release from FEMA saying that they're making changes to the individual assistance program. And this included like providing alternative ways of showing ownership. This was published in September 2nd. And the main point is that, FEMA is now saying that it's trying to further equity. However, we don't know like how this like will actually like play out in Fiona. So we don't know if the FEMA staff are in Puerto Rico know about this big news. So part of the recommendations is like the need to notify staff, to train staff, to notify the applicants that this is an alternative, and of course, to be able to work directly with advocates. And in terms of Fiona, John already like shared some statistics here of the numbers of people that apply, and just like how many have been approved until now. 26% of the applicants have been approved. However, like about like 98% has received about $700, and this is like through the critical needs assistance. So it's like we're still kind of like waiting to see like how much this like sworn statement will be used, how much like FEMA will and staff will promote it, how many denials will be made at the end, and very much also importantly, how much are people going to receive. And that's probably like a point for conversations at another time. Again, I just wanted to direct you to this article that it has like more details, especially like quotes from people, and a lot more like discourse and what all this means for equity. So thank you very much. You can reach me at evisgarcia@tamo.edu. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Evis, for speaking with us today. I'm wondering if you were asking FEMA, what can they do right now to make sure that more households in Puerto Rico have access to that sworn statement? What are the things that FEMA can be doing?
Yeah, so I think that one of the things is like doing training to people, right? So right now they're like hiring local people. So that's like one of the things, and then obviously at the disaster recovery centers have like these forms, and just be like immediately using them, right? And again, I think that there's also what just community organizations can do as well, because like some of them have been really great about asking also like FEMA locally to do a better job of like showing this as an alternative.
Thank you so much for joining with us. We are, if you're able to stay on and answer any questions in the Q&A box, please do that. I know that this is certainly going to be an issue that the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition focuses on going forward. There's been an incredible progress over the last couple of years, thanks in large part to our partners in Puerto Rico and elsewhere, but there's still a lot more to be done. And to talk a little bit about next steps and legislation that would help address some of these issues, I'm going to turn it over to Noah Patton, our housing policy analyst here at LHC.
Hello, my name is Noah Patton. I'm a housing policy analyst here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, primarily handling disaster recovery. Yeah, I think this is a nice little dovetail to what we've all been talking about throughout the session so far here. And specifically, that is a legislative expansion of the reforms that we've been talking about that FEMA made last year. Just kind of going back to, recap, I think we talked a lot about the impact of title documentation in Puerto Rico, but I think it's also important to note that this issue has popped up in various areas across the country, predominantly in the American South, as well as in the areas of California impacted by wildfires, specifically with a lot of often migrant farm workers living in manufactured housing as well. And I think it's also important to know that FEMA has known about this issue for quite some time. So I was very happy that under the new leadership of Deanne Criswell, they were able to get these changes made. Talking about specifically the Housing Survivors of Major Disasters Act, this is a piece of legislation that we've been heavily involved in, along with the all of our partners on the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition. It was introduced last year in the House, the latest version, that is to say, we've been pushing it for several years now, by Representative Adriana Espaillat of New York, and it was passed out of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, and it was just recently reintroduced in the Senate by Senator Elizabeth Warren with 14 Senate Democratic co-sponsors. I was going to waste time by reading them all, but I will allow y'all to Google it instead, since we're doing pretty good on time, I think. Specifically, talking about what this bill actually does. What does the Housing Survivors of Major Disasters Act actually do? First and foremost, for our purposes, is it number one, allows individual assistance, FEMA IA, to be used for titling services to establish ownership. Many people don't know that the title documentation, like getting a title if you don't already have it, is an incredibly long and expensive process involving, lawyers, court hearings, public advertisements, and so on and so forth. So by allowing FEMA assistance to kind of cover some of those costs, we open that process up to disaster survivors, so that when they're impacted by another disaster, this problem will be solved. Second of all, it expands the number of documents that can be used to show ownership in order to receive assistance. So this is expanding it to things like, let's just pull up the list here, expanding it to things like utility bills, tax receipts, school registration, mortgage documents, driver's licenses, and so on and so forth, to really kind of increase the ability of a disaster survivor to show that they own their own property following a disaster, in order to receive assistance, of course. And next, it creates a standardized declarative statement form. And I think Evis kind of mentioned this. So currently, FEMA does accept this declarative statement form. However, it's a form that you kind of draft on your own. And because of that, there's not a lot of people know how to do that. Not a lot of people have access to information showing how to do that. And so what's important about this bill is that it would standardize the use of that form, creating a standard form for all 50 states and the territories that would include the information that they need to sign it and swear under penalty of perjury that they own that disaster damaged home. And so by doing this, we hope that it will be easier to share this document at disaster recovery centers, to share it with disaster survivors, to share it with legal aid organizations that will then assist their clients in filling it out, because apparently it seems to be very difficult in order to do that right now. So that would definitely improve kind of the use of this declarative statement form moving forward. And perhaps most prominently, it retroactively applies to victims of Hurricane Maria. So as we heard, over 77,000 households in Puerto Rico were denied because of their lack of title documentation. By applying this change retroactively, it would allow those people that were denied assistance during Hurricane Maria because of these unfair rules that had been subsequently reformed and improved. It would allow them to reapply for assistance based on these new rules. Just, because the response to Hurricane Maria was admittedly so faulted and the rates of denial so high because of this issue, we believe that it is imperative that as we look forward to ensuring that future disaster survivors can utilize these benefits, we also need to look, in the rearview mirror to ensure that nobody's being left behind while we, fix this for the future, hopefully. And then in addition, this bill would approve the Disaster Housing Assistance Program, or rather it would require FEMA and HUD to discuss implementation of the Disaster Housing Assistance Program after every major disaster. The Disaster Housing Assistance Program, or DHAP, has been successfully utilized in disasters in the past, both by Republican and Democratic administrations, and essentially it's a program that would combine a portable emergency housing voucher with HUD facilitated housing counseling to ensure that disaster survivors are able to access permanent housing or housing that'll be permanent for them moving forward, and ensure that disaster survivors won't have to be moving between a hotel, a rental housing to a temporary housing unit or something like that. This program, the strength is by decreasing the amount of those moves and combining it with the expertise of HUD, who of course have decades and decades and decades of experience housing people that are in a vulnerable situation. So it's kind of taking the best of both worlds in terms of HUD assistance, HUD expertise in housing, as well as FEMA's ability to rapidly implement a program following a disaster. And despite of all these great things I just said about it, it has not been approved since before 2017 at the very least. And we've been pushing for either DHAP or a similar program called DASH. We've been pushing for implementation of those programs for quite some time, but this bill would move that conversation very quickly to the forefront by ensuring that HUD and FEMA are talking about implementation of this program following a disaster, and hopefully doing so where it is necessary, which I would say for Hurricane Ian and Hurricane Fiona would be right now. So that's what the Housing Survivors of Major Disasters Act is. You can certainly stay tuned to these calls, as well as the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition's additional calls to find ways to plug into advocacy efforts around this bill, as well as many of our other legislative and administrative priorities. And we'll go from there. I think next slide, perhaps.
Before we wrap up, Noah, I just wanted to ask you, so how can people get involved in terms of that bill? Should they be asking their members to co-sponsor it? Or in what ways can they lift up that bill? Yeah,
I think asking your representatives in Congress, asking your congressional senators, or your senators to support this bill is always an excellent idea. I think right now is a pivotal time to be doing that because, as demonstrated by us having these national calls, it's certainly at the forefront of everybody's mind. So I think moving forward, looking towards the end of the year, we certainly have a limited timeline to pass these bills. And I mean, in addition to that, right, those records from Hurricane Maria will only be around for so long. So we're certainly on a timeline to pass that bill. So there's certainly a sense of urgency. So I'd say, I'm sure we'll be putting out, calls for sign-on letters and the usual things that we do when we're attempting to sway congressional opinion on a bill. But just talking to your own senator or congressman is exceptionally helpful right now.
Okay, thank you so much, Noah, for joining with us. I see on the slide we have a list of all of our national calls and our working group calls. If you're interested in joining, you can register using the links or reach out to Noah and we can get you set up. I want to thank everybody for joining today's call. It was really helpful, I think, to hear from so many speakers. You notice maybe a trend where many of our speakers were talking about the challenges that are ahead, especially for people living in Puerto Rico, people who have mobile homes, people who have inherited their properties, largely households of color who historically have been denied FEMA assistance because of these title issues. And we want to keep track of the changes that FEMA has made in the past year and push them to move forward so that we don't see the same inequitable outcomes as we have traditionally. So with that, I'm going to sign off and we'll see everybody next week. Thanks for joining with us.